She was mostly gone. A pile of ash sat where a human being had once been. The chair was barely scorched. The rug underneath was intact. Her skull was present but shrunken. Her foot remained, still in the slipper. But the rest of her? Vaporized. The police were baffled. The fire department couldn't explain it. The FBI stepped in. And the newspapers ran with the phrase that would follow this case forever: spontaneous human combustion. They called it rare, mysterious, maybe even impossible. But in a small Florida apartment on a hot July morning in 1951, something happened to 67-year-old Mary Reeser, something no one has ever fully explained. This is the Lantern's Tale, and it begins with fire. St. Petersburg, Florida, July 2nd, 1951. The sun was already rising over the Gulf. Humid, still, no wind, nothing unusual. At 8 a.m., a local woman named Pansy Carpenter left her apartment and went to deliver a telegram to her landlady, Mary Reeser, a widow living alone in apartment 349. The door was warm to the touch, too warm. She tried the knob, couldn't turn it. Knocked, no answer. And then she noticed a black, oily substance seeping out beneath the doorframe. It didn't smell like food. It didn't smell like anything she could name. So she called the police. And when the fire department forced the door open, they didn't find a fire. They found what used to be Mary Reeser, or part of her. What remained of Mary was confined to an area less than 4 feet across. Her chair had collapsed into ash. Her body had been reduced to the same, except her left foot, still inside the blackened slipper, completely intact. The surrounding apartment told a different story. Nothing else had burned. Not the rug, not the walls, not even the pile of newspapers stacked just feet away. A mirror on the wall had warped. Some plastic buttons on a light switch had melted. But that was it. There were no flames, no smell of smoke, no sign of struggle, no fuel source, no accelerant. Mary Reeser, 67 years old, was almost entirely cremated, and yet her apartment looked untouched. It made no sense. And that's what scared everyone most. The coroner, Edwin T. Boughton, was among the first officials to respond. He had seen deaths in every form: violent, peaceful, accidental. But this? It looked like a cremation. But it wasn't in a crematorium. And no one had reported a fire. The human body does not simply incinerate. Even in professional cremation chambers, it takes temperatures of 1,400 to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit to reduce a body to ash, and that process takes 2 to 3 hours. It requires controlled conditions, enclosed heat, industrial fuel. Mary's body had been burned to a crisp, but her apartment hadn't. The odds of that happening naturally? Incineration-level heat in a localized pocket without burning the rest of the room? Next to zero. And yet it had happened. Her skull was still present, but distorted. Dr. Boughton noted that it appeared shrunken, not cracked or exploded from the heat as expected, but drawn in on itself, almost unnaturally. He would later say that it was the size of a teacup. That detail caused a media frenzy. Newspapers around the country ran the story. Woman mysteriously incinerated in her own home. Body reduced to ash, foot remains. Human Torch case puzzles experts. Locals whispered of curses. Others claimed UFOs. A few pointed to the occult. But police? They had no theory. The FBI? They had nothing conclusive. And the public was left with one terrifying possibility: that the human body could spontaneously catch fire, without warning, without source, and without mercy. But who was Mary Reeser? She wasn't a recluse. She wasn't strange. She wasn't involved in anything sinister. She was a widow, a mother. She had moved to Florida from Pennsylvania to be closer to her son, a doctor. She had lost her husband a few years earlier and had taken up residence in the small, tidy apartment near the beach. Her days were quiet. She read, smoked, wrote letters. That evening, July 1st, her son had stopped by to say goodnight. She had been sitting in her chair, wearing a flannel nightgown and house robe, and told him she had taken 2 sleeping pills. She said she was a little drowsy. She also mentioned that it had been a hot day and her apartment had no air conditioning. There was nothing unusual about the visit, nothing that hinted at what was coming. But now, investigators started trying to reconstruct the scene, and quickly, a few details stood out. First, Mary Reeser had been a regular smoker, often lighting cigarettes while seated in that very chair. Second, she had taken sleeping pills that night, possibly making her unresponsive if something went wrong. Third, there was an electric clock near her chair found melted and frozen at 4:20 a.m. This gave investigators a rough time of death. So the theory began to form, at least among skeptics of the paranormal. Maybe she fell asleep with a lit cigarette. Maybe it fell onto her nightgown. Maybe the fabric caught fire slowly. Maybe her body fat provided a sustained fuel source. And maybe the fire smoldered inward, consuming her torso, while creating a kind of wick effect. But even with that theory, problems remained. For starters, the wick effect wasn't fully understood in 1951. The idea, later studied in forensic science, is that the human body can act like a candle if the clothing is ignited and body fat melts into the cloth. The body essentially fuels its own burning, turning into a low-intensity but long-lasting fire. It's horrifying. But even with that model, the temperature and duration required to reduce a body to ash without igniting nearby flammable objects is almost unheard of. No one could explain how Mary's leg remained unburned, or how the room never filled with smoke, or why no neighbors heard a thing. In a building that size, even a small fire should have triggered alarms, smelled, been noticed. But Mary Reeser burned almost silently, as if consumed by something no one could see. The FBI took samples from the scene, sent them to Washington. They found traces of greasy soot, consistent with human fat combustion. There were no signs of accelerants, no gasoline, no alcohol, no chemicals that could have started a fire. They ruled out foul play. They ruled out suicide. They ruled out murder. But they couldn't rule out the impossible. So the FBI did what most institutions do when faced with an unexplainable event. They filed the report, stamped it inconclusive, and moved on. The final death certificate listed Mary Reeser's cause of death as burned to death by fire of unknown origin. No further explanation was ever given. The apartment was cleaned, the chair removed, life in the building returned to normal. But the questions never stopped. Years later, new forensic scientists revisited the case. Some believed the wick effect was enough. Others weren't convinced. In 1998, Dr. John DeHaan, a fire investigator, conducted a series of controlled burns using a pig carcass and fabric to simulate the wick effect. He showed that, under the right conditions, a body could be almost completely destroyed without scorching the room. But Mary Reeser's case still stands out, for how quickly it happened, for how little damage was done to her surroundings, and for the almost surgical way her body disappeared. Even among spontaneous combustion cases, hers remains one of the most unnerving. Because she didn't cry out. No one saw flames. No one smelled smoke. One moment she was alive, the next, ash. There have been other cases, of course. Other people who burned in ways that shouldn't be possible. Other victims whose bodies turned to powder while carpets remained untouched. But Mary's is the one that haunts forensic textbooks. Because her death raised more questions than it answered. And because it happened in a world that wants everything to make sense. She didn't die in a fire, she became the fire. And what happened to Mary Reeser may never be fully understood. She was a mother, a widow, a woman alone in her apartment on a quiet summer night. And something consumed her from the inside out. Science may catch up someday. It may explain what happened, chemically, physically, biologically. But that doesn't make it less disturbing, because we don't expect our bodies to betray us. We don't expect to vanish, without violence, without warning, without noise. But sometimes, that's exactly what happens. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories, if you dare.